In the remote wilderness of Colorado, a camping trip for a father and his young son turned into a nightmarish tragedy, leaving behind a chilling mystery. Picture this: a rugged campsite near the Black Canyon, the scene of an unimaginable crime. When the authorities arrived, they found an overturned tent perched on the edge of a rocky cliff, its contents grim and harrowing. 3 men, bound and lifeless, lying beneath a blood-soaked tarp. Mark Langford, his brother Andrew, and their son were brutally murdered under the cover of night. But what led to this? And who could be behind such a terrifying act? For days, Mark and Andrew, along with their young son, were missing. The search that followed uncovered more unsettling questions than answers. Was it a random act, or had they fallen victim to someone with a deep, personal connection to the wilderness? Clues and suspects emerged, each more mysterious than the last. Join us as we delve into this disturbing tale, piecing together the truth behind the Langford family's tragic fate. If you're captivated by this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video to stay updated on the latest episodes. Let's uncover the truth together, one chilling clue at a time. Mark Langford had been planning the camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a getaway for him and his son Andrew. They needed to reconnect, to bond in the wilderness. Mark had always been a lover of nature. For years, he'd dreamed of taking Andrew to the Black Canyon of the Gunnison. The park's remote, rugged beauty was perfect for an unforgettable weekend. Andrew was eager, a 9-year-old with an adventurous spirit. He looked up to his father, admired his strength, and relished their time together. It was a chance to escape the crowds. The Langfords were well prepared. Mark had spent the last week making sure they had all the camping gear they needed: a 3-person tent, sleeping bags, food, and all the tools for survival. Their blue Honda Odyssey was packed to the brim. Mark double-checked the cooler, ensuring there was enough food for the weekend. They were ready. The excitement in the car was palpable. A father-son adventure was about to unfold. At 8:32 a.m., they hit the road heading south from Denver. The journey to Black Canyon was long, but the view from the minivan windows made it worthwhile. Andrew kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. Mark drove confidently, knowing that once they arrived, they'd be able to enjoy the quiet solitude of the canyon. It was a time to escape, to recharge. Nothing would interrupt their peace. After hours on the road, they made a quick stop at a gas station near Salida. Mark filled the car with gas and bought a bag of dry firewood. Andrew was already looking forward to the hike ahead. The excitement grew as they neared their destination. The rugged beauty of the Black Canyon stretched out ahead, a landscape Mark had visited years before but wanted to share with his son. At 5:41 p.m., Mark and Andrew reached the entrance to the park. The ranger on duty gave Mark an information booklet marking their destination, a remote campsite near the south rim. It was just the place for solitude. The weather that evening was unpredictable. Clouds gathered ominously over the canyon, but Mark wasn't concerned. He reassured Andrew that everything would be fine. The storm was a fleeting worry. They'd set up camp. By 8:47 p.m., Mark called his brother Carol to update him on their arrival. The camp was set, but the weather was turning. He said, "The weather is changing, but everything is fine so far." That was the last conversation Mark had. The call ended abruptly, the connection dropping just as he finished his sentence. Mark was confident they would be fine. Little did they know that would be their last night together. The tent was pitched by the edge of the canyon, the black rocks looming against the darkening sky. The sound of wind rustling the trees filled the air, but the camp was otherwise quiet. They settled in for the night. As night fell, the canyon seemed to hold its breath. Mark and Andrew rested under the stars, unaware of the storm that would soon sweep through the area, both literally and metaphorically. They had no way of knowing that the next morning they would never leave the canyon alive. No one would hear their cries, no one would see them again. They had no idea what was coming. The morning of August 10th dawned, and the storm had passed, but there was no sign of the Langfords. Their planned hike to one of the canyon's lookout points never happened. Something had gone terribly wrong. The canyon, known for its remoteness, was now silent, its stillness a haunting indicator that something was amiss. The usual bustle of campers and hikers was gone. The Langfords' camp was completely abandoned. By late afternoon, the park rangers were notified. Mark and Andrew were officially missing. A search began, but their campsite yielded no signs of trouble. It was as though they had vanished into thin air. The day after Mark and Andrew's arrival, the weather seemed to change rapidly. A cold front moved in, making the temperature drop. The wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves of nearby trees. Mark wasn't worried. He had been through worse weather conditions during previous camping trips. He assured Andrew that it was nothing to worry about. After all, they were well prepared for anything the wilderness could throw at them. The campsite was set up just as Mark had planned, with the tent securely anchored and their gear stored safely inside. The night was quiet, with only the occasional rustle of wind. However, something felt off. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was just a fleeting thought, but it nagged at him. Andrew, oblivious to any danger, was already asleep in the tent. The feeling didn't go away. Mark lay awake for hours, listening to the wind howl through the canyon. He tried to dismiss his unease, but his mind kept drifting back to that strange sensation. The night passed without incident. In the morning, Mark made breakfast over the camp stove while Andrew played nearby. There was still no sign of anyone else around, no other campers, no hikers passing by. They planned to hike to a nearby lookout point, but Mark's unease lingered. As they packed up their gear, he noticed that something didn't feel right about the campsite. He couldn't put his finger on it. Mark decided to check the surrounding area before heading out. He wanted to be sure that everything was secure, just in case the storm had caused any damage. As he walked around, he found nothing unusual. The path to the lookout was clear, and Mark felt a brief moment of relief. He hoped that his anxiety was just a result of too much thinking, and that the day would proceed without issue. Andrew seemed eager to get moving. Mark smiled, reassuring his son that everything was fine. They set off down the trail, unaware that the trip would take an unexpected and deadly turn. The canyon, which had seemed peaceful the night before, now felt eerily empty. Mark couldn't shake the sense of isolation. The more he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Their hike took them deeper into the canyon, the towering cliffs around them feeling increasingly intimidating. The trail grew steeper, and the wind began to howl again, making it harder to hear anything else. Mark stopped for a moment to catch his breath, glancing back toward their campsite. It was still visible in the distance, the lone tent sitting quietly against the rocky landscape. He thought about the storm from the night before. When they reached the lookout point, the view was stunning, but Mark felt uneasy, almost like they were being drawn into a trap. He pushed the thought aside and focused on Andrew's excitement. They stayed at the lookout for a while, taking in the view. Mark tried to enjoy the moment, but his instincts were telling him that something was wrong. He didn't know what it was, but he couldn't shake the feeling. As the day wore on, they began to make their way back to the campsite. The unease that had been building since they arrived was now almost unbearable. Mark quickened his pace, eager to return to their tent. But when they got back to the campsite, they were met with silence. There was no sign of anyone nearby. No hikers, no rangers, no fellow campers. It was as though the world had gone quiet. The evening of August 10th passed without a word from Mark or Andrew. The lack of communication was strange, but no one was immediately concerned. After all, they could have simply changed their plans. The night grew colder and the wind picked up. Mark and Andrew had not returned from their hike, but there was still no reason for alarm. They were experienced campers, familiar with these conditions. Mark was a seasoned adventurer. He had taken Andrew on several trips before, and they had always been safe. They knew how to navigate through storms, how to set up camp in challenging environments. But this time, something felt different. As the hours passed and no sign of Mark or Andrew appeared, the growing silence began to feel unnerving. No hikers passed by and no other campers were around. By midnight, the thought of a delayed return started to feel less plausible. Mark's phone call from earlier that evening was the last contact anyone had with him. The growing worry was starting to set in. The absence of any sounds or activity only deepened the unease. No movement, no other campers making noise. It was as though the world around their campsite had gone quiet, almost as if it was holding its breath. By the following morning, August 11th, the situation became clearer. Mark and Andrew were missing. No one had seen them on the trail, and their tent had been left undisturbed. The air was filled with tension. As the day progressed, the realization set in. The Langfords were nowhere to be found. A call was placed to the park's administration. Rangers were alerted, and a search was initiated. The park was vast, and the possibilities were endless. Rangers began looking through the campsites, checking trailheads and hiking routes. The idea that Mark and Andrew had wandered off the path seemed unlikely. They were experienced, and this wasn't their first trip into rugged terrain. The search stretched on through the day, but by the evening no sign of the Langfords had been found. Rangers combed through the area near the south rim, but it felt as though they had vanished into thin air. As the search continued, more people were drawn in to assist. Other campers were questioned, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. The silence was both deafening and unnerving, making it even harder to piece together the mystery. The days passed, and with each one, the disappearance felt more inexplicable. Mark and Andrew had vanished without a trace. No one could understand how this had happened, especially given their extensive experience. The park seemed to hold on to its secrets. The silence, the empty campsites, the lack of clues, everything pointed to the impossible, that Mark and Andrew were lost, or worse, taken. But by whom? As the days turned into a week, the frustration mounted. Rangers and volunteers scoured the canyon, using every tool they had at their disposal. Still, no trace of the Langfords. It felt as if they had been erased from the land. On August 13th, two rangers stumbled upon something unexpected. A glint of something caught their eye as they patrolled the southern edge of the canyon. It was a tent, overturned and lying in a precarious position. The tent was an unusual sight, one that was quickly noticed for its placement. It was overturned, its stakes and guidelines torn from the ground. It was clear that something had gone wrong, something violent. Nearby, they found signs of struggle, a broken lantern, an empty cooler, and drag marks leading away from the tent. It was as if the campsite had been abandoned in a hurry. The hair on the ranger's neck stood up. As they approached the tent, the air around them thickened. The first responders slowly opened the flap. The bodies of Mark, Andrew, and their son were inside. Their hands and feet were bound, and they lay beneath a blood-soaked tarp. The discovery of the overturned tent sent shockwaves through the search team. Rangers quickly realized they were no longer dealing with a simple missing persons case. The scene hinted at something far darker. Inside the tent, Mark, Andrew, and the young boy were discovered, bound and lifeless. Their bodies lay beneath a blood-soaked tarp, the unmistakable signs of violence evident. The air was thick with the weight of tragedy. The first responders carefully cataloged the evidence around the campsite, making sure not to disturb anything important. A broken lantern was found near the tent, along with an empty cooler, its contents scattered around. Drag marks led from the tent, disappearing into the rocky landscape. The signs were strange and troubling. There was no indication of what had happened, only the overwhelming sense that something terrible had unfolded. The authorities immediately expanded the search radius, securing the area and preventing anyone from entering. It was clear that something violent had taken place, but the full extent of what happened remained unknown. As the team examined the scene, forensic experts noted several important details: the absence of a murder weapon, the blood-stained tarp, and the way the bodies were bound. It all pointed to a violent and brutal attack. Despite the lack of obvious signs, the search for further evidence began immediately. Rangers started looking for any possible clues that could explain why Mark and Andrew had been targeted. Were they victims of a random act? The surrounding area was scoured for footprints, fingerprints, or any other trace evidence. The authorities were determined to piece together the mystery, but every lead seemed to point to more questions than answers. The search team expanded their efforts, hoping to uncover any trace of the perpetrators. Yet, as the hours turned into days, no solid evidence surfaced. The case had quickly grown more complex and mysterious. Rangers worked tirelessly, going over the evidence they had. No murder weapon had been found at the scene, which was unusual for such a brutal crime. The lack of a weapon only made the situation more baffling. As the investigation progressed, the authorities focused their attention on possible motives. Why would anyone target Mark and Andrew? Were they simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was this something more personal? Rangers continued their search, hoping for a breakthrough. Yet, each day that passed brought more frustration. The Langfords' disappearance was a puzzle, and the pieces just didn't seem to fit together. Despite the challenges, the search team remained focused. They expanded their search even further, questioning any nearby campers who might have seen something unusual. Still, nothing pointed to a clear suspect or motive. One of the key questions was whether Mark and Andrew had encountered anyone during their hike. Could they have crossed paths with someone else on the trail? Investigators began looking into any vehicles that had been in the area. The park's visitor logs were reviewed, and surveillance footage from the entrance cameras was analyzed. Anything that could provide insight into who might have been in the park at the same time as the Langfords was carefully scrutinized. As the investigation deepened, the authorities also examined the possibility of wildlife involvement. Could animals have been responsible for the deaths? However, the lack of evidence supporting this theory made it seem unlikely. Despite all their efforts, the investigation continued to hit dead ends. With every new discovery, the mystery deepened. The case was turning into something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. The search for answers became an obsession for the investigators. Each clue, no matter how small, was carefully considered. But as time passed, it became clear that the case wasn't going to be solved easily. The authorities continued to investigate the site of the Langfords' tragic end, their efforts intensifying after the shocking discovery of the bodies. Mark, Andrew, and their son had been bound and left to die in the tent. The sight was unsettling. Forensic experts and rangers carefully examined the tent. The binding of their limbs seemed methodical, calculated. The way they were positioned beneath the blood-soaked tarp suggested a grim and brutal execution. There was no sign of a struggle outside the tent. The evidence indicated that Mark and Andrew had been ambushed or attacked unexpectedly, likely during the night. The mystery surrounding their deaths only deepened. Nearby, the investigators found drag marks in the rocky ground. It was as if the bodies had been moved after their deaths, but there were no clues as to why or who could have been responsible for the act. A broken lantern was found a few feet from the tent, but it hadn't been knocked over during a struggle. This raised questions. Was the lantern a clue to something larger, or was it simply left behind in haste? The cooler, which should have been stocked with food, was found empty, with its contents scattered around. Whoever had been there seemed to leave in a hurry, abandoning their gear in a careless fashion. The tarp that covered the bodies had clear bloodstains, but no immediate signs pointed to how the victims were killed. The lack of a weapon left investigators grasping at straws, trying to figure out the cause of death. Forensic teams carefully began to analyze the bloodstains on the tarp. They compared the blood found at the scene with DNA from the Langfords. But the results revealed something unexpected: blood that did not belong to them. The discovery of foreign blood samples on the tarp was a game-changer. It meant there was another person involved. The mystery of who this person was and why they were at the site remained an urgent question. As the investigators worked tirelessly, they realized that this crime was anything but random. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a wild animal attack. The evidence suggested something far more personal, possibly targeted. The authorities started considering the possibility that the Langfords had been specifically chosen, not by chance, but by design. The lack of a weapon, the absence of a fight, and the nature of the killings pointed to a planned attack. Evidence also revealed that the Langfords' vehicle, a blue Honda Odyssey, was left in an odd position. It had been parked 300 yards from the campsite, with some items still inside, but crucial camping gear had been missing. The investigators speculated that Mark and Andrew had been ambushed by someone familiar with the area. It was unlikely that they had stumbled upon an unsuspecting stranger. Whoever did this had a reason. The search for the weapon continued, but there was no breakthrough. With every step forward, more questions emerged. Who could be behind the deaths? What could have motivated such a brutal and calculated act? The mystery was becoming more intricate. The authorities had to consider all possibilities. While clues pointed toward someone close to the area, there were no solid leads to connect the evidence with a suspect. The investigation took a turn as the authorities reviewed the park's surveillance footage. They scoured every inch of the tapes, hoping for a glimpse of someone entering the park around the same time as the Langfords. They found a vehicle that matched the description of one seen near the Langfords' campsite. The dark-colored SUV was captured on camera just hours before the murders took place. This was the first concrete lead. The discovery of the foreign blood on the tarp marked a turning point in the investigation. Authorities were no longer dealing with an isolated case. They were chasing down the involvement of another person. Forensic teams worked day and night, analyzing every piece of evidence. The mystery surrounding the Langfords' deaths grew deeper, and the question on everyone's mind was clear. Who was responsible for this brutal crime? With the blood matching someone other than the victims, investigators began to piece together a profile of potential suspects. The park's visitors were thoroughly examined, but the list of individuals with any obvious connection remained small. One key clue was the mysterious vehicle captured on surveillance footage. It appeared to have entered the park just hours before the deaths. The investigators identified the vehicle as a dark-colored SUV, a Chevrolet Tahoe. The next step was tracking down the owner of the SUV. Investigators found that the vehicle was registered to a man named Greg Hansen, a local guide who had been in the area recently. Hansen, a 40-year-old man known for his work as a rafting and fishing guide, had a questionable history. He had been involved in multiple incidents, some of which raised red flags for law enforcement. But Hansen wasn't an immediate suspect. His name hadn't appeared in any initial searches, and there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. Yet. The SUV was simply the first connection to the area. Investigators began to dig into Hansen's background, focusing on his history of water safety violations and unlicensed firearm possession. They soon learned that his career had been a mix of legitimate work and shady activities. Hansen had worked as a rafting guide in the area before, but he was not an official park employee. His knowledge of the terrain made him a person of interest, but they needed more to tie him to the Langford case. The search for Hansen turned up more troubling details. Witnesses reported seeing him on a trail near the Langfords' campsite on the same day the family disappeared. The sighting added weight to the theory that he was involved. As investigators continued to probe, they began to link Hansen to the crime scene in increasingly significant ways. His history with the park, combined with the mysterious vehicle, made him a prime suspect. Authorities moved quickly to question Hansen, but he was nowhere to be found. His disappearance after the incident was alarming, and every lead suggested that he was evading the investigation. The case began to unravel a web of deceit. Hansen was on the run, and investigators started following a trail that could lead them to answers. The silence around his disappearance was deafening. Hansen's sudden absence created a sense of urgency. As authorities searched for him, they uncovered more evidence suggesting he had been involved in the Langford family's tragic deaths. It was clear that time was running out. Search teams expanded their efforts, scouring Hansen's known haunts and other potential hiding spots. With no solid leads on his whereabouts, it became increasingly clear that he was attempting to disappear completely. The authorities had no choice but to focus their efforts on finding Hansen. They began reaching out to local residents and businesses, hoping that someone had seen something that could provide more information about his disappearance. Meanwhile, forensic experts were still working on the blood samples found at the crime scene. They continued to analyze the genetic material, hoping to uncover more about Hansen or any other individuals involved. The search for Greg Hansen had become a priority. With each passing day, investigators uncovered more about his questionable background. Yet the more they learned, the more it became clear that Hansen was not a stranger to violence. Hansen's history was troubling. Known for his involvement in previous altercations, including a violent assault at a campsite in Utah, he was no stranger to trouble. His reputation made him an obvious suspect. Witnesses from around the park reported seeing Hansen at various points on August 9th, the day the Langfords disappeared. He was seen near the trail leading to the South Rim, the area where the family had camped. However, when investigators tried to speak with him, Hansen had vanished. His phone was turned off and he had disappeared from his usual haunts. It seemed as though he knew he was being watched. The authorities quickly discovered that Hansen was familiar with the park's terrain. His knowledge made him a prime suspect. He had access to remote areas and was likely aware of the park's less traveled spots. Several tourists who had visited the park that weekend recalled seeing Hansen arguing with another man near the trail. The confrontation seemed tense, but the identity of the second man remained a mystery. The man Hansen had been arguing with seemed important, yet no one could identify him. This man's involvement became crucial to the investigation. Was he an accomplice, or simply another witness to the crime? As Hansen's trail grew cold, investigators focused on the second man. Witnesses described him as someone in his 40s, with a triangle tattoo on his forearm. This detail would prove key in their search for answers. Hansen's connection to the second man was still unclear. The two had been seen together, but no one knew if they were friends, associates, or something else entirely. All that remained were questions. Authorities combed through Hansen's known locations, looking for any connections to the second man. A new theory emerged. Perhaps Hansen wasn't alone in the attack. Maybe the crime was the work of more than one person. It seemed increasingly likely that the Langfords had been victims of a planned attack, not a random encounter. The more investigators dug into Hansen's past, the more it seemed that this was a targeted act. The possibility that Hansen had an accomplice filled the investigators with urgency. They began reaching out to more witnesses, hoping someone had seen the second man or perhaps even recognized him from the argument near the trail. With new descriptions coming in, the search for the second man became the focal point. His triangle tattoo could be a distinctive clue, one that might link him to a specific group or place. The investigators considered all possible leads, even revisiting past suspects. Hansen's history, combined with the new descriptions, painted a picture of a man who could be dangerous and who may have planned the entire attack. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation seemed to stall. The search for the second man intensified, but no one seemed to know who he was or where he might have gone. He had vanished without a trace. Despite the setbacks, the authorities remained determined. Every lead was followed, every detail carefully considered. They knew they were getting closer to unraveling the mystery, but time was running out. As the investigation continued, Hansen's absence became more significant. The authorities began to treat him as a priority suspect. Every hour spent searching for him brought them one step closer to uncovering the truth. As the weeks passed without a breakthrough, the investigation into the Langford family's deaths reached a critical point. Despite exhaustive efforts, the case remained unsolved, leaving many questions still unanswered. Greg Hansen's disappearance was troubling. The authorities were no closer to finding him, and his involvement in the attack seemed increasingly likely. His sudden absence only intensified the mystery surrounding the case. Investigators re-examined the clues they had, but nothing seemed to lead them closer to Hansen or the second man. They had pieces of the puzzle, but they couldn't yet put them together. Every lead seemed to fizzle out. There were no confirmed sightings of Hansen, and the second man's identity remained elusive. The authorities had no choice but to keep searching, hoping for a break. Despite the challenges, new information began to surface. A report from a local farmer named Paul Merrick added a new piece to the puzzle. He had seen a suspicious SUV near the canyon just days before the murders. Merrick's sighting was valuable. He described the vehicle as having a trailer with an inflatable kayak, a detail that matched the description of Hansen's truck. The connection between Merrick's sighting and Hansen was undeniable. The authorities quickly followed up on Merrick's lead. The vehicle had been registered to Greg Hansen. This was the first confirmed connection between Hansen and the area where the Langfords had been killed. Merrick's report also provided a new clue. The man driving the SUV had been checking something on the trailer which seemed unusual. This strange behavior made the authorities suspect that the man knew the area well. Hansen's knowledge of the park, coupled with the kayak sighting, suggested he had planned his escape route. It was now clear that he might have used the river to flee the crime scene, a calculated move. Rangers continued searching for Hansen, focusing their efforts on the riverbank where he might have traveled. But even with this new lead, finding Hansen proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. As time went on, the investigation became more about locating Hansen than solving the crime itself. The authorities had no doubt that he was the key to unraveling the truth behind the Langford family's deaths. The search was exhaustive, covering every inch of the river and its tributaries. But Hansen remained elusive. It was as if he had planned his escape perfectly, evading capture at every turn. Despite this, investigators didn't give up. They continued to piece together the evidence, knowing that the key to solving the case lay with Hansen and his connection to the river and the canyon. The more the authorities dug into Hansen's past, the clearer it became that he was not a man easily found. His history, combined with his sudden disappearance, pointed to a man who had gone into hiding. The investigation entered its most frustrating phase, with few new leads. However, the authorities knew that if they could find Hansen, the answers they sought would finally fall into place. In the months that followed, the search for Hansen intensified, but his whereabouts remained unknown. The case went cold, but the Langford family's deaths were still fresh in the minds of the investigators. As the investigation stagnated, the authorities began considering a darker possibility. Hansen might have been working with someone else. The second man, whose identity remained a mystery, could have played a crucial role in the killings. While Hansen remained the prime suspect, the investigation never stopped. The hope remained that new evidence would eventually surface, finally revealing the truth about what happened to Mark and Andrew Langford.